Hi there, this is Phil with Phil Effects, and I've got another video. This one I want to do just a rough overview of how you set up a scene using a imported tracked camera, and it's part of the project we're doing in 245 this semester. And I've actually did two scenes. I did an outdoor scene and an indoor scene, and I'm just going to demonstrate the indoor scene, but the outdoor scene works the same. So let's go ahead and get started. I've got my scene here, and it's just opened up, and the first thing we need to do is import the tracked camera. So we go to File and Import, and there's this indoor FBX and an outdoor. We want the indoor, so let's go ahead and open that up. And when it comes in, you can see what's imported is the camera, and there's a bunch of points here. And these are the tracking points. So when those were exported, the tracking points went with it. And we can go in and I can look through the camera node. And if I select it here, things will highlight. And we can play this back. And you can see how this is moving. And everything is tracked. And if we go back to my perspective camera and zoom around a little bit, you can see how things are placed in 3D. So you can see all of these trackers right there, and these were tracking off the top of the table, and you'll see the scene, but this is a plant that's in the room. And then some of these other points are some extraneous points. These actual tracks aren't too great. In fact, you'll see when we put an image plane on here that some of these kind of slide around a little bit. But the thing we're most worried about or most concerned about is what's going on right here, which is the plane of the countertop. And that tracked quite well. Another thing I want to point out is when I did the tracking and set this thing up, this was set for 25 frames per second. So when you set your project up, that's what you want. The animation will actually be automatically set when you import the FBX, but it's just something you need to be aware of. So let's go ahead, and we want to create an image plane, because the image plane is going to be the actual video that was tracked with the camera. So let's hit create an image plane, and we'll go in, and it's in the source images folder, which if you set your project up correctly, you'll have, Maya will automatically look in that source images for the source images, and we want the indoor folder. And I go inside that, and we just need to click on one. So I click on the very first frame and say open. And we want to use this image sequence, so we want to be sure and click that. And then if I go back in and I look through my camera, we can see the scene, and if I go ahead and hit play, we can see it playing. And there you can see some of those guys are sliding a little bit, but all of the trackers, look at all the trackers here, they're locked down pretty hard. There's a little bit of shifting, but not much. And so for the purpose of what we're doing in class, this should work fine. And so the camera is tracking well to the visual scene. So let me go ahead and hit stop and go back. And so what we want to do is, if you're doing a project with this indoor scene, then you're going to put a character or a dinosaur or a lizard or a bug or something you've made in 3D. And we want to import that and put that in this scene so it can be seen. So the way we can do that is we'll go in, and first thing I need to do is I need to put in a plane that's going to be on this countertop that will allow things that are placed on top of the countertop to cast a shadow. So that's very simple to do. We just go in here and I put in a plane, and let me move this a little bit. We can put this down here, and let me track it just a little bit this way so I can see how things look. And I want to move that this way. And let me scale that just a little bit. So I'm going to scale it in just a little bit. And I want to rotate that. So what I'm looking at to see that I want to rotate it, you can see the point right there is almost going off, and then it's fairly wide over here. Same kind of thing as we get over here. You can see it's not exactly lined up. So I want to rotate this in the y-axis just a little bit. And so let me turn that just a little. And then let me hit R again to scale that just a little bit. And I want to scale that this way. And let's see how this lines up in my scene. That's fairly good. Let me bring this in just a little bit. Right there, because there's the end of the counter. And I can see I need to rotate this just a little bit more. And then one thing I want to do is let me get out and look at this in perspective mode. And so now I'm looking at this in perspective mode. And what I want to do is let's look at a 3-camera view here. And in particular, let's zoom in on some of these. So we can see there's a fairly close trend that everything is a little bit at an angle. So typically when I do a track, I want to straighten this out and make it flat before I export it. This didn't get exported completely flat, but we can see that there's a bit of a problem there. So we can fix that. What we need to do is we just take our shadow plane, and the shadow plane is literally the top of the countertop. So I'm going to take and I'm going to pick that up just a little bit and go back, and I'm going to put just a little bit of rotation on here. So I'm kind of lining up the average of the crosshairs is what I'm looking at here. And so let me go back and let me look at this one, and let me zoom in. From that perspective, that looks pretty good. So now let's go back in and look at the camera node, and hit R, shrink that just a little bit, and shrink that a little bit this way, and line this up. Again, what I'm looking at is I'm trying to line this up with the scene so it looks like it all lines up correctly. And that's pretty good. All right. So if I take and we follow this, we can see that lines up fairly well. Oh, it looks like I'm a little off by a little bit there. So let me slide this way and hit R and scale that up just a little bit. All right. Okay, that'll work. So now that I have this, the one thing I want to make sure I do is I don't want to move this thing again. All right. So I'd like to lock this down. So I want to put this in a layer. And the other thing you want to lock down is you want to lock down the camera. You don't want to move the camera. So let's lock both of those. So let's go in, and I'm in the camera node, and we go up to view here and we say lock camera. So that locks the camera. Locking it just means I can't add additional translations to it. Okay, the movement of the camera still is there, but now I can't go in, hold down the Alt key and drag and mess the camera up, which you don't want to do. So I have the camera locked so I can't mess it up. The other thing is I want to lock this plane down so I don't move it. But before I lock it down, I actually want to take and put a material on it. Okay, so let's make sure we have Arnold loaded, and it is. I've got the Arnold Render is loaded, so I can select this and do a right click and come down here and add a new material. And we want to add a special Arnold material. So I go over to Arnold, and what I want to do is I want to use this AI shadow matte. And this is a very special layer. What it'll do is it won't render with a color, but what it does is anything that's a shadow will image onto that, and it will show it as a shadow. You'll see this when we get a little further in here. So I'm going to add that shadow matte layer to it, and there's no changes I need to make to it. And I'm just going to take and click this, go back to my channel box, And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to create a layer that included that. And let's just call this shadow layer. Hit save. And I'm going to go ahead and make this a reference. So now, because it's a reference, I can't go in and select that layer. All right. So now we're good. I can go in there and I can take these points, and we don't have to view those. So I can take all of these points here and do a Control H and hide them. Oh, okay. There we go. Control H, hide those. There we go. I was grabbing the wrong thing. Okay, so I can hide those. All right. So now what I want to do is I want to put a something that I can light and put in my scene that's equal to, not equal, but it's the same, similar in concept to what you're doing in class. So I'm just going to put in a sphere. And the scale is obviously quite big. So I'm going to take and scale this down. And make this a little smaller. W, bring this up. Bring it a little smaller even. Bring it up. And we'll just call this a ball. And call this shadow plane. And let me double check the placement of this with perspective camera. Yeah, that's what I wanted to see. So I've got it punching through the bottom of the shadow plane. I really don't want that. So let me go in and I'll pull that up just a little bit. So it's just kind of sitting right there on top of that shadow plane. All right, so then let's go back and look through the camera again. And let me take and I'll move this here and here. And let me shrink that down even just a little bit more. It doesn't need to be quite so big. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to put a material on this ball, and that's simple. We'll just go in and we'll place assign a new material, an Arnold, and what we want here is just our standard AI standard surface. So I do that, click on AI standard surface. I'm going to use one of the presets, and I know it just went off their screen here, but I'm going to go ahead and pick plastic. And so we're going to put an Arnold plastic material on there. And so now I have a plastic material on the ball, and I have my scene. The next thing I want to do is, there's no lights in this scene, and so if I hit render, I'm not going to see anything. I know that. So I want to go in and get some light in my scene. And if I take my shadow plane and go back over here, turn the visibility off, let's take a look at this. So we can see here, this was taken in my kitchen, and the major lighting source actually is still the sun. We got direct light. There's some lights overhead, and so they're coming down fairly parallel. And I can say that because the edges here are fairly clean. Okay, you can see the edges of these shadows. A little bit fuzzy on the edge, but they're somewhat fairly defined. All right. So for a first pass, I'm just going to go ahead and use a direct light. So I'm going to go in here and create lights, and I'm going to create a Maya direct light. And that comes in the scene scale-wise being very big. So let me hit the R key and just scale that down. Simply scaling a direct light doesn't change anything. All it does is changes the size of the icon so I can work with it in the scene. And let me move this up. And as we all know, when you're working with direct lights, the only thing that really matters is its position. So I'm going to take and move this, have this angle down just a little bit, And let's look at its attributes from the attribute editor and come down here to the Arnold tab, and we're casting shadows. So let's just go ahead and we'll do a test render. And again with Arnold, sometimes it's a little bit picky. And when you're working with Maya, what you need to do is first go in and do a Maya render and force it to say render and use, see that it did it again. So when you open up Maya for the first time, if I just hit render, it's going to render the perspective camera. I don't want that. So I want to render this camera. So I render that. Okay. And so now that one's picked, but I really don't want to use the Maya render view. I want to use the Arnold one. And because with that, I can actually go in and I can modify things. So let's go in and we'll hit a render. And we can see that there's my light. And okay, we're back. I don't know what Arnold was doing. It just acted funky. So I just went ahead and rebuilt things again real quick to get it so it would work right. Basically, I did the same thing, so that nothing is different in here. So we've got the ball, and now we're casting a shadow. And one of the nice things you can see with Arnold is you can work interactively with it. So a couple of things, the shadow itself is quite long, so I can go in here and I can shorten that up. Okay. And then the other thing is the color of the shadow is not quite right. I mean, obviously this is very dark, and this is light and transparent. The other thing is the edge here is way too defined. So the couple of things we can fix with that right off the bat is if we, the sharpness of the edge is defined by the light. So with the directional light selected, I can go in here and there's this angle parameter. And if I go in and start increasing the angle, we can see that I'm starting to get some fuzziness around the edges. So let me crank this up a little bit. And so now that's even getting softer, but it's also getting noisier. So to reduce the noise, let me take the samples up to about 10. And I want to take that, increase the angle just even a little bit more. All right, that's looking good. The length of the shadow is still a little bit long, so I can reduce that by moving that. And the other thing is the direction I think is a little bit wrong. So I'm going to take and slide the light this way. Okay. So then the last thing we want to do is work on that shadow color. And the shadow color I can get by selecting the plane and get the shadow matte, and right here is the shadow color itself. So I can open up a color wheel, and one of the nice things here is I can just go in here with an eyedropper and select on there, and I can get the color right there from the just selecting it. So that gives me a close approximation, and so then I can go in here and turn the saturation down a little bit, turn the brightness up, and then I want to take the opacity and bring that down so that shadow is transparent, so we can see through it. All right, so we can say that, and let me make it a little bit darker. Knock down the saturation a little bit. You can see basically what I'm doing is I'm playing with the values here on this shadow matte layer, and I'm getting it so what I want to do is get it so this shadow looks the same as that shadow. And I can sit here and I can probably twiddle these knobs for about another 20 minutes to get it so I really like it. But this gives you an idea real quick of how this works. And let me say done and accept that. So we have a shadow matte, and the thing that's interesting with that is so that docked it so we can see the two together. And I can go in, and then if I wanted to, I can take this sphere and I can move it. We can see how that moves in the scene, and so we can see oh, I punched it down. I didn't want to do that, but here we go. So we can see sliding this around, and if you have an animation of a character, your character will do the same thing. And if I pull this back out again, so we have the view, and this won't animate well because it does take a lot per frame, but you can see as you animated all the frames out, you would get an animation with your CGI object that's been placed with a two-dimensional video background, and you can cast shadows, which gives a certain believability to the whole composition. So hopefully this will help the students out and anyone else who's looking in real quick. And it's just a quick overview, like I said, of how to create a 3D scene where you integrate 3D objects and lighting into a two-dimensional video background. So this has been Phil with Phil Effects. Thanks a lot. Bye.